Hey everybody, this is Matt Atkinson, and you're watching Forward Gettysburg with Aaron Smith.
What is going on, everybody? Aaron Smith here for Forward Gettysburg. Super excited to be here with you guys on what is probably one of the coldest days of the year so far. A balmy 23 degrees here in northern Maryland. I am coming to you from Union Mills Homestead, a beautiful historic area here just north of Westminster, about 3 miles from the Pennsylvania line. And today's episode, we are going to explore and see and travel the very same roads and see the very same sites that the 20th Maine and the rest of the 5th Corps would have seen on their way to Gettysburg. So without further ado, let's get into it. We know the 20th Maine was in the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 5th Corps. That brigade was led by Strong Vincent, a native Pennsylvanian from up around Erie, Pennsylvania. Now, this brigade would have been the vanguard or the lead element, or the guys in front, to put it very simply, of the 5th Corps. And the interesting thing is that it wasn't always the same brigade in the front when these troops were marching. They would cycle through their marching order. That way, it wasn't always the same brigade at the end of the line, quote unquote, eating dust. So on June 30th, the 5th Corps with the 20th Maine, the 83rd Pennsylvania, the 44th New York, the 16th Michigan, they are going to march from Liberty, Maryland, which is just east of Frederick, Maryland. They're going to undergo a grueling march to Union Mills. That march is going to be about 20 miles, and they're going to encamp here at Union Mills. The day before, the 29th of June, this whole area was swarming with Confederate cavalry. Actually, Fitzhugh Lee made his headquarters here at the Union Mills homestead, and they're going to camp out here before departing for Hanover, Pennsylvania along the old Hanover Road on June 30th. Now, this mill where Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry would have been encamped was under the ownership of Andrew Shriver, a staunch Unionist. And when Fitzhugh's cavalry is camped here, he's going to try to procure all of Shriver's horses. However, Shriver is going to say that the horses are too far away. Fitzhugh is then going to say, I will take you captive unless I get those horses. And he's going to add, I'd rather have the horses. You can see where his priorities lay. He really didn't want to take any citizens captive in the place of horses. Eventually, those horses will be procured. Andrew Shriver is going to leave an excellent journal. And if you guys check out the Union Mills Homestead website, you can see a lot of the journal entries that he wrote down around this time during the Gettysburg campaign. And on June 30th, he's going to say, the rebel cavalry passed on this afternoon, 5th Corps Sykes, Union infantry arrived and encamped in our fields. General Barnes and staff headquartered here. So it's really cool that this building behind me, this gorgeous old farmhouse, this would have been a grist mill, a tannery, but Barnes, General James Barnes, actually made his headquarters in that house on June 30th. Shriver will then go on to add in his diary for July 1st. This morning, about 9 a.m., our men left in the direction of Hanover. You notice he says our men, clearly showing that he was a Union supporter here. So behind me runs Big Pipe Creek, and beyond that you might be able to make out some guardrails. That's the current day Old Hanover Road. However, that's not the road that the 20th Maine and the 5th Corps would have taken north towards Hanover. Rather, in fact, you can see the continuation of the driveway in the parking lot here. It's very likely that this right here was the original roadbed that the 20th Maine would have taken. And to prove my theory, I took a look at some old maps of Carroll County, and there's an 1862 map that shows in really great detail the route that Old Hanover Road would have taken north to the Pennsylvania line. And when you compare that map to a modern day view on Google Maps, you can see the original alignment of the road is just a little bit to the east of the modern day alignment of the road. So it's very likely that that 1863 alignment, the road that the 20th Maine would have taken, would have gone along this area right here and then connected to where the modern day Old Hanover Road is currently. The 20th Maine, the rest of Vincent's Brigade, and the 5th Corps would leave this area around 6 a.m. and the road ahead of them is going to be very, very hilly, very, very rough terrain to pass. But it's really, really cool to stand here and know that I'm very likely standing where the tents and the camp of the 20th Maine and the rest of the 5th Corps was. It's really, really cool being here. And I highly, highly recommend you guys check out the Union Mills Homestead. Maybe not when it's 23 degrees outside, but this spring or summer, if you're visiting Gettysburg, take the trip. It's maybe 15 miles south and check out the Union Mills Homestead. So guys, I'm currently right off the Old Hanover Road here. This is at the intersection of Lepo Road and Old Hanover Road. And the reason I wanted to film here is, one, you can start to see the elevation. These guys had to march down and up and down and up. It's very, very hilly terrain here. It's probably a very, very exhausting march. I can only imagine marching with your rifle, all your ammunition, your gear, your knapsack, all your tins and utensils and all these kind of things. Not only that, but you also had the artillery, the supply wagons, all this stuff that had to go up and down, up and down. It's going to be a very, very slow, grueling march. And at the fastest pace during the Civil War, these men could cover about 2 miles to 3 miles an hour marching. So you can imagine just how grueling this truly was. But the thing I wanted to share with you guys, a little bit of a personal experience with this march that the men of the 20th Maine took, is that when I was younger, my dad was working on a house maybe a couple miles down Lepo Road here. And I remember very, very distinctly one day he came back to the house with a bag full of old Civil War musket balls, and I believe he had some cannonballs with him as well, as well as with some like various items, small little belt buckle trinkets, stuff like that. But it was really, really cool. And as I was making this video, that memory came back to mind, and I thought, wow, like that very easily could have been ammunition left over maybe by Jeb Stuart's cavalry or even the 5th Corps on their way to Gettysburg. And so I apologize ahead of time because of the wind, but I'm currently where the Maryland and Pennsylvania border is. You can make out just behind me, the dark road is Maryland, the lighter colored asphalt is Pennsylvania. Now, no doubt, when the men of the 5th Corps crossed over this Mason-Dixon line, they let out a shout. They were back in friendly territory. Now, let's continue on with our journey. Now, this beautiful scene behind me is the modern-day Long Arm Dam, just south of Hanover. We are right on the border of York County and Adams County. Now, of course, during the Civil War, this dam wasn't here. None of this water would have been here. So the Old Hanover Road, which you can see makes a very sharp turn right behind me, would have continued straight down this farm lane through to the other side and then continue north towards Hanover. So the 20th Maine will finally reach Hanover, Pennsylvania around 3 p.m. on July 1st. And when they get here, they're going to start to unpack. In fact, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in his official report says the following: "My command on reaching Hanover, PA just before sunset on that day were much worn and lost no time in getting ready for an expected bivouac. Rations were scarcely issued and the men about preparing supper when rumors that the enemy had been encountered that day near Gettysburg absorbed every other interest. Very soon orders came to march forthwith to Gettysburg." Now, Hanover, Pennsylvania on July 30th saw a cavalry clash here between Jeb Stuart's cavalry and elements of Ellen Farnsworth and George Custer's cavalry. Now, an interesting fact is that George Custer, this was his first battle as a brigadier general. Another really, really cool thing they have here at Center Square, Hanover, which is where I'm standing, is this is the #1 serial number of the 10-pounder Parrott rifle. This is really, really cool, guys. This is serial #1, the first one off the line. But it's no doubt that the men of the 20th Maine and the rest of the 5th Corps, upon reaching Hanover, they could see the aftermath of the cavalry clash that happened here just the day before. Perhaps there were still some wounded and some stragglers out in the streets. Maybe there were even some dead lining the streets as well in Hanover. But they're not gonna stay very long here. Like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain says, he gets an order to move out. The men of the 5th Corps and the men of the 20th Maine, they're gonna be here for maybe 3-4 hours at the most before they head east to Gettysburg. And the route they're going to take east is going to be modern day 116, the Hanover Road at the time. So they're going to head toward McSherrystown and out toward 116. Now, another little fun story that has to do with them moving out toward Gettysburg is that upon receiving their orders, Colonel Schweitzer's brigade and Colonel Vincent's brigade, they're going to have what's described as an exciting little run to see who would lead the column on their way towards Gettysburg. Vincent's brigade would win that run and remain out front of the 5th Corps, remaining the vanguard of the 5th Corps. All right, guys, so I am currently leaving McSherrystown, and I am on modern day Route 116, headed toward Bonneauville. Bonneauville at the time of the battle was known as Bonnetown. Interesting thing about McSherrystown is that the only report I could find that mentioned McSherrystown was the report of Samuel Crawford. Of course, he was the divisional commander of the Pennsylvania Reserves. And the interesting thing about that is that Crawford's division was actually a little bit behind Barnes's division and the other division in the 5th Corps. But I'm headed here on the Hanover Road. So behind me through my window, you guys are very, very likely going to see many of the same sights that the 20th Maine and the boys in the 5th Corps would have seen on their way toward Gettysburg. And what I think is really cool, and what I've come to appreciate the older I get and the more I read about the Civil War and the movement of troops throughout this area, is that a lot of these roads that I've grown up on, learned how to drive on, you know, these roads were used by troops around the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's really, really fascinating to come to realize that a lot of these roads that I've taken for granted are roads that are very historical and roads that these armies traveled upon. I mean, Old Hanover Road there from Union Mills to the Pennsylvania border. I distinctly remember my dad getting in his truck, which was a stick shift, and say, "You're going to learn how to drive a stick shift today, boy." And, you know, take me up and down those hills. And oh my gosh, I stalled out. And I mean, you know, you learn how to drive a stick, you're going to stall out. So those are certainly fond memories, but I never really realized just how historic those roads were. And I've really come to appreciate that the older I get and the more I study the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'm currently reaching the outskirts of Bonneauville, or as it would have been called at the time of the battle, Bonnetown. And even now, it's a very, very small town, hardly even a borough, more like a glorified village. So I can only imagine the time of the battle was probably much, much smaller. We're talking a fraction of the size of Gettysburg, which at the time of the battle was around 2,500 people. So they're going to arrive here around 1 a.m. in the morning. And George Sykes, they're going to stop here and rest for a little bit. Now, the march from Hanover to Bonneauville isn't really that long of a march. It's maybe 4 or 5 miles, if that. However, you have to realize these men have now been marching nonstop for the last week or so. They have been trying to catch up to Robert E. Lee in Pennsylvania. And it has been grueling, grueling marches. In fact, just over the last 24 hours, they've marched over 20 miles. So they're going to rest here in Bonnetown. And in Bonnetown, they're going to rest for maybe 2 hours before heading out. George Sykes, in his official report, he is going to state that he is going to head out before 4 a.m. Some other reports are going to say that the men are back on the road toward Gettysburg by 3 a.m. in the morning. And Bonneauville, or Bonnetown, really isn't that far from Gettysburg. We're talking maybe 4 miles, 5 miles if you're really going to push it or exaggerate and tell a tall tale. But it's really not that far from Gettysburg. So on the late evening, early morning of July 2nd, they are going to head out from Bonnetown and head towards Gettysburg. So as I alluded to earlier, the men of the 5th Corps and the men of the 20th Maine by this point are clearly exhausted. However, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is going to mention in his report that despite being exhausted, his men were moving with a promptitude and spirit extraordinary. What a great way, what a very poetic way to describe that. As they move toward Gettysburg, the men of the 5th Corps, led by the 20th Maine and Strong Vincent's Brigade, they are going to turn off somewhere and head toward the Baltimore Pike. And here's where the story gets a little bit confusing. Here's where I had to do a lot of research. I scoured over maps, I scoured over reports, all types of writings from the National Park Service online, all the resources I had at my disposal to determine where the 5th Corps turned off at. I ignored my wife for nearly 3 or 4 hours while doing this research, just staring. So huge shout out to my wife for putting up with my Civil War research and general nerdiness. I found a resource through the National Park Service that said that the men of the 5th Corps turned off near the Deerdorf Farm. Now, I looked up where the Deerdorf Farm was, and that is going to be in the area of the intersection of modern-day US Route 15 running north to south and Route 116, which is the road that we were just traveling on. However, I did a little bit of pinpoint way marking and map marking online and found that from Bonnetown, modern day Bonneauville, remember, to that point where the two roads intersect is 3 miles, around 3 miles. But as I started to read and look into these reports, I saw that many reports mentioned that the men only marched 2 miles. Colonel Rice of the 44th New York, who will eventually take over command after Strong Vincent's mortal wounding, describes marching 2 miles. Divisional commander of the 1st Division, the division that the 20th Maine was in, James Barnes, he describes marching 2 miles. Major William H. Lamont of the 83rd Pennsylvania, the same brigade as the 20th Maine, he also mentions a march of 2 miles. So what I did is I set a waypoint at Bonneauville, and then I set it out 2 miles to the west. And 2 miles to the west brought me to the Low Dutch Road. Currently, I'm standing at East Cavalry Field. Behind me, about 200-300 yards, is going to be the intersection of the Hanover Road, modern day 116, and the Low Dutch Road. So I buy into the theory that the 5th Corps more than likely did not turn off near the Deerdorf Farm at that intersection of modern day Route 15 and 116, but rather turned off at the Low Dutch Road. It lines up with several of the reports. It wasn't just one guy guesstimating, hey, I think we marched about, 2 miles or so. No, these were several sources of commanding officers that listed a distance of a 2-mile march from Bonneauville before turning off. So I am going to put forward the theory, and please feel free to refute it. Look into it yourself. This is what makes learning about history so great, but I'm putting forth the theory that the 5th Corps, the 20th Maine, turned off at the Low Dutch Road and headed toward the Baltimore Pike. The Low Dutch Road was a road that existed during the Civil War, but you have to imagine very few of these men, probably none, knew anything about Adams County, especially some of these old country bumpkin back roads that they were taking. So none of them are going to list, oh, we turned off on Low Dutch Road. You know, they're not going to list the exact name of the road. But a lot of the reports describe them crossing a creek and coming up on the right flank of the Union line. Now, if you take the Low Dutch Road, that's going to shoot you out to the Baltimore Pike. And I'm going to show you guys that as we drive along here and continue our journey. So I'm now at the intersection of Low Dutch Road and the Hanover Road, modern day 116. And like I said, this is where I really firmly believe that the 5th Corps and the 20th Maine turned off of the Hanover Road to head towards the Baltimore Pike and the right flank of the Union line. When it really comes down to it, we can get into the weeds about, inaccurate measurements during the Civil War of miles and, measurements. And these guys didn't really know how far they were marching. It's not that they just plugged it into the GPS and, went from there. But when you look at military operations, there's a certain degree of accuracy that's needed. Otherwise, you can end up lost. You could, and end up in some pretty bad situations. So I'm going to give credence to a lot of these reports, especially the 3 that I mentioned, Colonel Rice's report, Major Lamont's report, and General Barnes's report, that they marched 2 miles. The infantry, I mean, they marched. They didn't ride horses. They didn't ride in wagons. They marched. So they would know probably better than anyone what a mile felt like. And if they say 2 miles, then hey, I'm gonna buy that as they figure they marched 2 miles. So right up here is where the Low Dutch Road intersects with the Baltimore Pike. And anyone who studies the Battle of Gettysburg knows that the Baltimore Pike was Meade's absolute most important route. It went down to his supply depot in Westminster. It was a route of retreat. It was also the main road in the area that covered Washington, D.C. Don't forget, when Meade took over command of the Army on June 28th, he was told to cover Baltimore and Washington. So this road is going to be absolutely vital to Meade's operations here in South Central Pennsylvania. So when the 20th Maine and the rest of the 5th Corps make their way to this area, they are originally going to take positions to the right of the Union line. However, they are soon going to receive orders that that right is now overextended. They reach Gettysburg around 7 a.m. They cross Rock Creek around 7 a.m. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, in his official report, describes crossing the creek around 7 a.m. But this position is way overextended. So they are going to be sent to an area between Rock Creek and Granite Schoolhouse Lane. So the 5th Corps is going to arrive somewhere in an area between Rock Creek and Powers Hill. I'm in the area between Rock Creek, which is going to be down in this direction, and Powers Hill, which is directly behind the camera. And as Sykes arrives to this area with the 5th Corps, he's going to receive an order to send a brigade, if possible, to support Sickles' 3rd Corps. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Meade is going to have a meeting with all of his Corps commanders, but Sickles is not going to be there. And when they realize, hey, where is Sickles? The fact that he moved his 3rd Corps forward nearly 3/4 of a mile ahead of the rest of the Army of the Potomac is going to come up, and they're going to realize that Sickles is out of position. Shortly after they all realize that Sickles is out of his position that he's supposed to be in on the Union line, a tremendous cannonade is going to open up on that left flank where Sickles is. Meade is going to order Sykes' 5th Corps to the left of the Union line to hold that ground at all hazards. And so the 5th Corps marched off into battle, into an unknown fate, and undoubtedly for the 20th Maine, and many men in Vincent's brigade marched off into the venerated halls of American history. Well, guys, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This was a really cool episode to do. I loved traveling around with you guys, showing you some of the roads that the 20th Maine and the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac would have taken, or even could have taken, to the Battle of Gettysburg. You know, it might be 23 degrees outside, but as you know, I am super passionate about this kind of stuff. I don't care, rain, sleet, snow, just like the post service, I'm going to be out here making great videos about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg campaign. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Please, if you're liking the channel, if you're liking what I'm doing, remember to subscribe and like this video. And if you like my sunglasses, they're new, leave a comment down below. As always, I'm Aaron Smith for Forward Gettysburg, and I will catch you on the next one.